Welcome to FO Live. With me are two eminent authors. Gary Grappo has been a distinguished diplomat for the US State Department. He was an ambassador. He was also the head of the office of the quartet, the Peace Quartet in Jerusalem. And of course, my familiar partner in crime, Glenn Carl. He retired as the Deputy National Intelligence Officer. He is a career, or was a career CIA officer. Some say they never retire. We hope he has. Without further ado, we'll jump into a discussion, a burning topic of our times, the Iran-Israel tensions. What has happened in the recent past is that Iran struck in Lebanon and killed, Israel struck in Lebanon and killed an Iranian general. Then it struck the consulate, the Iranian consulate in Damascus, killed someone else, another Iranian. Iran got upset about it, warned, and then struck Israel in a combination of a drone and missile attack. And then Israel has struck Iran. As of now, tensions seem to be cooling down. Everyone seems to be taking a deep breath, but it's the Middle East, and we never know what may happen. And I will ask Gary Grappo to explain what exactly is going on and what are the ramifications of this most recent flare-up.
Well, thank you very much, Atul, and it's a pleasure to join you and, of course, Glenn in this session. I think what we've seen over the course of the last now 3 weeks is a significant, probably the most significant increase in tension between between Iran and Israel, which prior to this period had been largely a shadow war that is fought by proxies in the case of Iran and through cyber attacks and direct attacks on the proxies, but both sides avoiding targeting the other side's home territory, so to speak. That changed dramatically following the Israeli attack on the Iranian consular facility in Damascus, which, as you mentioned, killed 7 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officers, including the most senior officer there, who was responsible for pretty much managing the movement of goods, weapons, individuals, and materiel between Iran and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and so probably coordinating the attack of the proxies.
Yeah, just to interject, this is someone who worked quite closely with Qasem Soleimani. Have I got that correct? The late Qasem Soleimani.
He would have worked with him, yeah, no doubt, and now had been working with his successor. And so clearly this was a major challenge to the Islamic Republic, and specifically to the IRGC, which had taken a bit of a beating. These are not certainly the first officers killed by the Israelis. By the way, these attacks are typically carried out by airstrikes, as this one was. And so in my own view, I think it was the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps leadership in Tehran that put a lot of pressure on the Iranian leadership to ratchet up this conflict by targeting Israel proper, which it, of course, did on April 13th with this barrage of drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles, really a swarm attack that occurred over a period of hours, and I think amounted to something like 330 drones and missiles, and surprisingly, to very little effect other than the political impact, which is quite significant and should not be underestimated. Israel vowed to respond and did, but did so in a very measured way, only responding with a limited strike against one facility in Iran proper, in the city of Isfahan, up very near the city of Tehran, where coincidentally are located Iranian nuclear facilities, not all of them, not the main one, but nevertheless some significant facilities, which were not struck. What was struck was an Iranian Air Force base, where apparently some of the either drones or missiles were launched toward Israel 13 or 12 days prior. So that's where things stand. It seems as though at the moment both sides are withdrawing, suggesting that for the time being, this particular episode of the conflict is over, and we'll have to see where things go from here.
Excellent. Now, Glenn, Gary has laid out in an outline what's going on. I look to you to explain the consequences of what has happened, because geopolitically and geostrategically, we are in brave new territory. Gary said, so far we had a shadow war, sort of a Cold War, but now the Cold War has turned hot. Both sides have struck each other, and this is the first time since 1948 that Iran has struck Israel. So far, many Arab states have invaded Israel. Arab organizations have carried out campaigns against them, military campaigns even. Some would say freedom movements, some would say terrorism activities. But this is the first time Iran has hit Israel. And some would say Iran has managed to hit Israel hard. So over to you, Glenn.
Well, in a what will sound almost perverse statement, I think, I have been encouraged. I was heartened by and relieved by the latest tit for tat, because both Tehran and Netanyahu, or Israel, have, I think, broadcast clearly that although we're engaged in some simian breastfeeding for status and to protect one's authority over one's own, have broadcast a continued desire and efforts to avoid having the Gaza, Hamas, Israel fighting expand into a regional war. And there's irony always in international relations, and here we have the Arab Muslim states coming to the rescue of Benjamin Netanyahu, of all things. I think thanks to what I believe is the continued underestimated, underappreciated work and successes of President Biden to, I think, coordinate in anticipation, coordinate a response if ever Iran were to strike. And it's thanks to the collective anti-missile systems of all the states in the region, Great Britain, the United States, France, and so on included, that the 330 drones didn't have more effect than to make a statement. Iran had to make a statement. Israel, prior to that, had to make a statement. Neither wants, in my assessment, to see the war expand. Although I think ultimately Tehran didn't order the October 7 attack, but bears responsibility for sort of inciting it. And I think the ultimate objective of the attack, aside from killing Jews and keeping Hamas relevant, was to stop the strategic tectonic shifts towards a generalized peace, coming at, as always, the expense of the Palestinians. So I have been encouraged by this, and yes, any missile strike, any violence by Iranian proxies or by Israelis or by Iran threatens a wider war, which would be catastrophic for the entire world. But the extraordinary efforts by all parties to avoid that event, a generalized war, I continue to find relieving, heartening, although that we have to engage, that one has to engage in these dances to avoid disaster is alarming by itself, of course, but relatively heartened by the outcome. The obstacle to all of this, for once, well, maybe not for once, is not Tehran's provocations, but the bind that Netanyahu has got himself and all the rest of us in.
So you talked about the bind Bibi Netanyahu has got the region and the rest of the world in. In what way has he led to the current situation?
Well, what was it, 6 months ago already, shockingly, time goes faster as you get older. It was quite clear, I think, to most that a conventional military, the IDF, Israel's army, could not achieve the ostensible objectives of the invasion of Gaza, which is to destroy Hamas as a coherent organization, fighting force, and to replace it. Short of killing more than 30,000 Palestinians, but short of an inconceivably horrible war, worse than what we've seen, devastation. You cannot kill, as the Israelis well know, you cannot kill an ideology or a theology or a movement or grievances. The Americans, and apparently all governments, grudgingly learn or never learn this truth because of emotion, anger, fear, and the feeling that we will do something. And dadgummit, these people are hurting us, and so we will strike back and eliminate them. And the somewhat, not derisive, but seemingly not serious enough term of playing whack-a-mole was what we came to call it in the U.S. government, which is that the U.S. military and intelligence community were very good at killing the head of operations for ISIS or for Al-Qaeda or for choose your group, as well as killing terrorists, or what we call terrorists. In Iraq, the life expectancy of a jihadist was 1 week. Specifically for foreign fighters. So that's pretty impressive, but it's also largely irrelevant or even counterproductive, because President Mubarak years ago exaggerated a bit, but made an important point when he said, if you kill one terrorist, you will give birth to 100. I think that exaggerates it by almost 2 orders of magnitude, but maybe not by 1 order of magnitude. So the Israelis, by invading, could not achieve what they did. And I think I'm tragically revealing as to why this happened. There are 2 things. One, I was in a panel discussion on a different network about the time of shortly after October 7th. And there were some Israeli reservists and soldiers and think tank people also involved, and they were beyond rationally furious. Well, I suppose fury and rationality are incompatible anyway. And they did not want to hear my effort to say that the IDF could not achieve its objectives. That was viewed as weak and as an apologia for Hamas and anti-Semitic almost. And that's what happened. So they invaded out of anger, and we are now stuck with the second thing, with that as the consequence of an action in anger. And then the second thing I'll finish, I'm sorry, is Netanyahu's clear bind that unless he continues, he's out of power. And if he's out of power, he might go to jail.
So let's look at Israel's 2 objectives in going to war against Hamas. Number 1, free the prisoners, which still remains a top national priority. And number 2, destroy Hamas. So far, they've failed in both. Are they likely to succeed with the current methods that they're persisting with?
Is that to me?
Yeah,
Well,
to
I
both
think
you
the
and
answer
Gary.
we've seen, the answer has been clear for 6 months. They have not been able to succeed. You know, literally my first job on my second day as a CIA officer, I took my oath on the first day and picked up various packets about retirement plans and all this sort of thing. And then the second day, I was assigned in the early 80s to the Lebanon desk. And I went from being a graduate student reading Raymond Aron to trying to track down what Hezbollah and other groups in Lebanon were doing to Americans and everyone else. And Hezbollah had kidnapped the head of the CIA office there, another Bostonian actually, named Buckley. Our top priority, not just my desk, the CIA's, the U.S. government's just about, was to save its own and to rescue William Buckley, held somewhere in the Bekaa Valley, we thought. And we are a pretty impressive organization in many ways, and the U.S. government has inconceivable resources. And even though we think we found him after a long period of time, the costs of trying to get him out would have been, in the estimation of all of the relevant parties in the U.S. government, so high in lives and political implications that we never tried. And ultimately, they killed him. And that is a cautionary tale, because it's almost what happens most of the time.
Aha. So you knew where Buckley was, and you still let him wither on the vine.
Well, it's a hideous calculus one has to make, but the assessment was that there would be many, many dead. The Middle East would implode or explode even worse than it had already done. This is during the Lebanese Civil War, which came after the Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon, well, all of Lebanon. So the choice was: are we willing to accept that as likely consequence, or try to find a less disastrous way to save Buckley? And we could not.
So what you're saying is the moral of the story really is discretion may be the better part of valor sometimes, and the Israelis did not heed that principle.
Well, that's certainly true, but there's a larger lesson that I'm trying to convey, which is that conventional military means are not the right way to address a threat of terrorism. Conventional military is good for conventional military. It is not good for terrorist-related issues. And an invasion does not address the hatred, ideology, fear, resentment, sense of loss that motivates 2 million Palestinians and some thousands to become willing to give up their lives simply to kill Israelis because they feel they have no option but dishonor or death.
Now, in the case of Iran, Israel is in a bind. Hezbollah has been raining down rockets on them since October 7th. Hezbollah, unlike Hamas, is a Shia militia, so it's even closer to Iran, perhaps the closest of the three proxies. The Houthis are their own. They are Shia, but not exactly. They are from a different sect, as Gary's explained to me many a time, and as I have read up on myself. Hamas is Sunni, and it could very easily be that some Hamas members tomorrow might start attacking Iran itself. The Shia-Sunni divide isn't dead yet. So Hezbollah is the closest proxy Iran has, and Iran has been involved in directing those attacks as well. So if you are Israel, Gary, what do? You're damned if you do, and if you're damned if you don't, because how do you protect yourself against Hezbollah?
Well, the Israelis have already taken measures to counter the current level of attacks they're experiencing from Hezbollah. And I'm sure they have many more assets that they can commit in the event that the conflict with Hezbollah, which is relatively low grade at this point, escalates. And you will recall early in the Gaza conflict, Israel, under the direction of Bibi Netanyahu, wanted to launch a preemptory attack against Hezbollah and was talked out of it by the United States, which was very fortunate because Israel would have been in a two-front war. And although the Israelis have the most capable armed forces in the Middle East, they would have been stretched and doubtlessly would have required direct assistance of the United States. And of course, the United States had deployed 2 aircraft carrier battle groups at the beginning of this conflict in anticipation that Hezbollah might try to launch an attack against Israel, which thankfully did not occur. In fact,
was it because of the US intervention? Some people credit the US for preventing that conflict.
Well, that was certainly an important factor for Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah. He was well aware of the destruction and devastation that Lebanon and Hezbollah specifically suffered during the 2006 war, which by any objective measure was won by the Israelis. But the Israelis did withdraw, and Hezbollah, having survived that conflict, was then seen by the wider Middle East as the victor. To this day, is still seen as the victor. But nevertheless, less than a year after that conflict, Nasrallah admitted openly in a media interview that he had made a mistake. He had miscalculated the response of the Hezbollah attack that killed a handful of IDF soldiers on the border and launched this massive attack, and Israel responded very, very forcibly, and it devastated southern Lebanon and probably started Hezbollah on this political downward slide in terms of its popularity in Lebanon. And there's a lot of resistance within Lebanon, even within Hezbollah partisans, to get involved in this conflict between Israel and Hamas, simply because it would rain down hell on Lebanon. Now, I don't want to underplay the threat that Israel would face. It would be substantial. It's been well published. Hezbollah has at least 150,000 various types of rockets, missiles, and drones, many with precision guidance. So they would inevitably be able to strike not just military facilities, but population sites. And it might require the intervention of the United States to head them off. But perhaps even more importantly, in terms of what discouraged Hezbollah, is Iran and how Iran views Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a strategic asset. All these other proxies, including Hamas, are viewed as tactical assets that can be moved around. They can target the Americans if you're talking about a various militia in Iraq or in Syria, or even the Houthis in Yemen. But in the case of Hezbollah, given the nature of their capabilities, they are viewed as a strategic asset to be deployed only when there is a direct threat by Israel against Iran, and specifically a threat that might involve nuclear weapons. And they're probably not going to use that asset, Hezbollah, unless it reaches the point where Iran truly feels that it is under a direct military threat that could inflict so much damage that they have to call in Hezbollah. So I think they're reserving that asset. Nasrallah, leader of Hezbollah, does not want to engage in a war with Israel unless forced to do so. They're happy to keep it at this low-grade level, as are the Israelis, I think. The Israelis can deal with it. Hezbollah can clearly deal with it. And it was interesting in this latest tit-for-tat attacks that were launched directly from the soil of one country against the soil of another country, that Iran still did not deploy Hezbollah. So there is an indication, a clear indication that the Iranians don't want to escalate. But I will add, as I often do, that the chance for miscalculation is very, very high, very high. Hezbollah launches an errant missile that strikes a populated area and takes out a number of Israeli civilians, or as we saw in the case of the Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, they launch some other attack, and it triggers the Iranians to respond as they did, or perhaps maybe even worse in the future against Israel. So the danger of miscalculation has escalated, even though both sides have indicated their intentions to de-escalate for the moment.
So to recap, Hezbollah is a strategic asset. Ipso facto, it's not expendable. The others are far more expendable. And Iran is reserving Hezbollah for a scenario where it perceives an existential threat. So, Gary, Iran struck Israel for the first time. You have been an Air Force officer. Where did they strike? What is the significance of the strike? I have friends from other countries who say that the fact that they were able to get through so many layers of air defense is impressive. It is a signal, and it is inevitably going to get the top brass in Israel worried. Your thoughts, sir?
It's not clear that they penetrated all the air defense systems. It's also unclear how many of these missiles detonated upon launch. That is, that they were unsuccessful in even getting off the ground. Be that as it may, some missiles or drones did manage to penetrate Israeli airspace. I would say it's probably fewer than half, and maybe significantly fewer than half. Nevertheless, it's a warning to the Israelis that the Iranians do have this capability. They use this swarm attack, which I think is an interesting indicator of warfare of the future, to attempt to overload air defense systems. I don't think the Iranians were able to succeed, and that's largely through the efforts of the United States. The United States was able to begin working with the Israelis well in advance of the attack, because the Iranians telegraphed the attack. The Iranians said they were going to launch an attack against Israel. So the Israelis, their American partners, and others could begin to prepare for such an attack. They certainly anticipated missiles, drones. I don't know whether they had anticipated the number, because this was a pretty significant number. But it appears that they were going after military targets, not civilian targets, although apparently some missiles were shot down dangerously close to Jerusalem, which, as we all know, is a holy site for Muslims as it is for Jews. And of course, there is a large Muslim Arab population in and around Jerusalem. Be that as it may, they did not strike any of their intended targets, to the best of our knowledge. Perhaps one and an air base in southern Israel. Israel had launched all of the aircraft based there. It was an F-35 base, the F-35 being the most advanced fighter jet in the world, developed by the US. Israel has, I think, at least a couple squadrons of them, but they were nowhere to be seen at the base, so there was no threat to them. And the damage, I think, at the base itself was pretty minimal. So the Israelis can certainly take heart that they were able to fend off this attack, but as you importantly noted earlier, not without significant help from the United States, as well as some Arab partners, which is also a signal to the Iranians. they have no friends in the Middle East, with the exception of Syria and their proxies. They're isolated, and that governments like Jordan, which was responsible for shooting down some of the drones, Saudi Arabia, which reportedly provided radar and other intelligence information into this air defense network, strongly differ with Israel on its policy in Gaza, but nevertheless came to Israel's aid in defending itself against Iran. And I hope the Iranians take note of that there is a strong belief on the part of these Arab governments that Israel is not the problem in the Middle East. Iran is the problem. And that's the problem they have to defend themselves against.
Mm-hmm. So Iranian paranoia is in part justified.
But I don't know if they care so much about it or are conscious of it even.
Well, I mean, they offer prayers in Arabic. They're all Muslim now, although they are Shia, but still they've adopted the they've adopted the religion of their conquerors.
Indeed.
I think that I took this recent Iranian response, the attack, the 330 missiles and drones, to be a larger version of what Tehran did several years ago now. I think Trump was in office at the time, in response to, that's right, in response to the killing of Soleimani by the United States. And they very clearly, they being the Iranians, very clearly said, well, we can't let this go by. We will respond. We are going to respond. We are going to respond at this hour and in this place. We are going to respond at this hour and in this place. And then they waited, and then they did, so that the United States had several hours to literally to put its personnel in bunkers. And then the Iranians blew up a field someplace adjacent to the military installation of the United States, so that their honor was upheld. They did respond to an assassination of one of their top officials, and yet they were careful to give all opportunities for the party they were attacking, the United States, to avoid having to escalate in response again. And Iran did that, and everyone has been very careful in this recent conflict to signal that on all sides, that no one wants a wider war, other than Hamas, which was, I think, desperately but understandably trying to avoid its long-term destruction through a generalized peace agreement with Saudi Arabia, which would have once again, between Israel and Saudi Arabia, left the Palestinians the great losers of history. The Kurds, the Armenians, the Palestinians, and the Jews are sort of the great losers in the Western world of the last century, and only they seek to change the tectonic shifts in the Middle East. Iran would like to do it too, but not at the expense of a wider war.
I think it's noteworthy, Glenn, that in the instance that you pointed out, when Iran responded to the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the IRGC, with a direct attack against the U.S. facility in Iraq, and then we see Iran's attack against Israel for the killing of its senior commander for the Levant, effectively based in Damascus. They're responding to attacks against very, very senior IRGC officers. So this is the only two occasions when Iran has done this kind of thing. And again, it leads me to conclude that the IRGC is driving decision-making in Tehran. That despite what they may say about the power of the supreme leader, he is becoming increasingly beholden to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. I'm not saying that they call all the shots in Tehran, but when it comes to conflicts in the Middle East, they are in a commanding seat, in my view, which is something to be concerned about because they represent this core of ideologically committed troops, very well trained. They get the lion's share of resources in terms of military appropriations in Iran, and see themselves as the true vanguard of the Islamic Revolution, which they effectively are. And as such, they are driving decision-making in Tehran, which in my view is dangerous when a military organization has that kind of power. The second thing I'll point out, maybe building on the point that you just made, Glenn, and that is, and I say this from the perspective of a former diplomat, there are clear intentions on both sides to ratchet down this conflict, as was evidenced by the nature of the attack, the way the attacks were announced, and then actually carried out, where despite the massive attack by the Iranians and a more subdued, but still very pointed attack by the Israelis, no one was killed. It's an important note. There is clear intention to turn down the level of violence in this conflict, which leaves a potential opening for diplomacy. Now, how one conducts diplomacy between one country that truly despises the other, it's a visceral hatred. I'm speaking, of course, of Iran's feelings toward Israel, is hard to imagine. And Israel, which harbors no real animosity against the Iranian people, or no real intentions of causing harm to Iran as such, other than, of course, to ensure that it cannot attack Israel. So is there an opportunity for diplomacy? I cannot say. I'm not aware of anything. You would need a highly trustworthy interlocutor who could speak perhaps for both sides, and I don't know whether that person or entity exists. Certainly not the United Nations. Anyone's thinking along those lines, it would probably be another country. By the way, that's not the United States, given the absence of a relationship between the US and Iran. So remains to be seen whether the two sides will look toward diplomacy.
So, Gary, given the picture you've painted of there being this vitriolic animus between Iran and, say, Israel, in Iran, which sees the US as the great Satan and Israel as a modern-day crusader state, and Israel, which sees Iran as extraordinarily dangerous and, in fact, an existential threat to Israel, given the fact that it backs the Hezbollah, it backs Hamas, and it backs Houthis. And the Houthis have closed down one of the big Israeli ports by blocking Bab el-Mandeb. So what are the scenarios going forward? Because one scenario, as you have indicated, is, well, both sides dial down and live in hatred, but not in conflict. Scenario two, both sides keep escalating pinpricks. Scenario three, the miscalculation, misjudgment, misperception scenario, things go really belly up and things go into all-out conflict. There could be other scenarios too, but where do you see the region headed?
Well, at this moment in time, given what certainly I know and what is known in generally, and we certainly don't know what's happening behind closed doors, it's not clear. It's not clear. We see lots of potentialities, most of which are very discouraging and depressing. On the other hand, if we get to the core of what is the cause for this commotion, which is an understatement, in the Middle East, I think we have to go back to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And if it were possible to first reach some kind of a ceasefire, which would include the release of however many of the hostages are remaining, that would be a significant step forward in reining in any potential for a conflict, because that is the casus belli for all of what we're seeing currently in the Middle East. Now, we can only go by what's been said publicly, and certainly the Houthis down in Yemen, and even Hezbollah, and the militia groups in Syria and Iraq have all said there's a ceasefire or an end to the conflict, that they would cease their efforts. I'm not sure I believe them 100%, but nevertheless, I think it's pretty clear that the conflict in Hamas, the broader conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians is what is driving this, which demands, therefore, that the Israelis, along with their international partners, find a way to reach this ceasefire, what might possibly lead to something more permanent down the road. I tend to agree with Glenn that it's going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to eliminate Hamas. I personally believe that they're probably looking to see whether they can kill or capture the two remaining top leaders of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar and Mohammad, and with that, they might decide to declare victory and begin the process of withdrawing, which they have been doing, by the way. We should note that there are not nearly as many ground troops in Gaza as there were at the outset of this conflict.
There are two wrinkles as well, added wrinkles, and they pertain to one, of course, Bibi staying on in power and having support of allies like Ben-Gvir, who is, shall we say, not exactly lovey-dovey and not exactly the most salubrious of characters.
Warm and fuzzy, I think, is the term you're looking for.
Yes, warm and fuzzy. And our listeners, I mean, some elements in Israeli politics have extreme views. They are racists. They even argue, some of them, of driving all the Palestinians out of this holy land. So Israeli politics has its own can of worms, and the rise of the far right in Israeli politics is dangerous. But that's one wrinkle. The other wrinkle is how the current war, the Israel-Hamas war, not to mention the adding of the Iranian dimension, has caused occurrences in American university campuses that are reminiscent of Vietnam. Look at Columbia. Look at USC, University of Southern California, not exactly known for its activism. Look at Berkeley, which of course is known for its activism. Look at Yale. I could go on. Your alma mater, Glenn, Harvard. I think Gary, Stanford, your alma mater, is so far safe from such a conflagration, but who knows for how long.
There have been quiet marches, but nothing as disruptive as what we've seen at Columbia or Yale.
Yeah. So exactly. So this internal dimension, and The Hill, which is a decent newspaper, had a headline saying that this issue, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, could see Joe Biden lose in the November elections, because a lot of Muslim Americans and young Americans are saying they won't turn up to vote. So what are the implications of both these developments? And I'll let both of you divvy it up or answer both.
Well, I'd like to. My response is slightly tangential, but not. I think it all fits together. The two of the most alarming.
You've read too many Greek epics, Glenn.
Well, I am currently reading yet another, but
Which
that's
one?
another story. I'm reading a biography of Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian, which is
Excellent.
by
Well, that's Roman, not Greek.
Anthony. Okay,
But similar.
but the particular characteristic that made him distinctive was his there was a Latin term which I can't recall because I don't speak Latin. Anyway, he was a devout follower of all things Greek, and he Hellenized the Roman Empire. But
Yes.
okay, in any event, the most disheartening 2 points or points that I have detected, or think I have, or read about in this whole crisis, are that polls show in Israel 70% apparently of the Israeli public continues to support strongly the military operations in Gaza, despite the fact that a majority of Israelis are seething in hostility towards Benjamin Netanyahu. The second thing is that most of the reservists, well, many the reservists in the IDF, in the Israeli army, who have been called up to serve, many of them were not sent into Gaza, but were doing stability peacekeeping patrols in the West Bank. So that's a sensible use of reservists. However, what's been alarming is that a significant number of them have engaged in brutal actions towards the Palestinians in the West Bank. And more alarming than that,
where the popularity of Hamas, if I may interject, has gone up. That is very worrying.
And I literally can't quantify how many incidents there have been, but there are many, even though I imagine that the majority of interactions and actions by the IDF in the West Bank have conformed to IDF principles and international standards and so on. Nonetheless, the reservists who have served in the West Bank have expressed increasing levels of animosity, hatred, disdain for the Palestinians in the West Bank. And these are people who, on the whole, are hostile to the far right in Israeli politics. These people, meaning the IDF reservists serving, because they're the general population, and hostility towards Netanyahu. Nonetheless, as indices of Israeli attitudes writ large, they're, to me, profoundly alarming, because for decades, I think observers have, at least American observers, have seen the only way forward pretty clearly, which is a two-state solution, which becomes every day less imaginable, and yet less imaginable still with the attitudes that we're discerning, or at least I fear I'm discerning from what the IDF reservists' attitudes are in the West Bank and their actions, and the attitudes of the Israelis towards the Israeli invasion of Gaza. Those two things run counter to what I was otherwise going to say seems to have been the structural problem, which is, as we all know, that the far right in Israel, through Netanyahu, has a stranglehold on Israeli policies and politics. And as Gary is pointing out, I'll call them the extreme elements in Iran do the same there. Otherwise, easy to say the word otherwise, as Dennis Ross has laid out for many, many years, and he did at the start of this conflict, the solution is possible, that you have a two-state solution, which finally would give the Palestinians literally somewhere to go, both physically and metaphysically. It would
I
give
think
them a
the
future.
metaphysical bit is more important because the Palestinians who are living in Jordan are not coming back. They're certainly
Well, they
not
would have
coming
some
back to a
future.
to a moth-eaten Bantustan.
Future other than being a subject people, in what the Israelis become incensed anytime anyone uses it, myself included, the term a de facto apartheid state. And I understand why there's a wall and why the Israelis don't want to have Palestinians freely running around, because the numbers of them kill Israelis. That's a fact. But so you have to eliminate the hold of the extreme right in Israeli politics. Easy to say, and you have to have Hamas also, which is the sort of the counterpart to the far right of Israel in the Palestinian context, actually lose power, as Netanyahu was ostensibly trying to do by the invasion. If those two conditions can be met, then the Saudis, the Americans, the international community, the EU have all made abundantly clear that there could be huge resources devoted to creating a viable state. Oh, and the third thing is that you need some Palestinian leadership that has at least a remotely acceptable level of support from the Palestinians themselves, because they aren't viewed as either jihadists who are going to sacrifice all of us for their millennial objectives, or so corrupt that all that's happening is that Palestinian sweat goes into private Swiss bank accounts.
Excellent. Very well put, Glenn.
Atul, I was reading recently something that I think is really noteworthy. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas,
yes, of course,
was
the blind
interviewed,
sheikh who was killed in an Israeli strike
in the early 2000s. I can't recall exactly when. Was interviewed by Hamas's monthly magazine back in '97, and was asked very pointedly, is there anything that could deter Hamas in its mission to establish a pan-Islamic state throughout the Holy Land? And Yassin's answer was only one, and that is if the Palestinians were given their own state. That
because that takes the wind out of Hamas's sails.
Hamas's raison d'etre no longer exists. No longer exists. And
by that extension, the raison d'etre of Iranian aggression towards Israel no longer exists.
Almost all of these groups in the Middle East, this is their one unifying element. This is the one element they all share. Their antipathy toward Israel for its refusal to sit down and negotiate a state for the Palestinians. And that statement was as accurate then as it is today. And if that were to happen, the driving force of Hamas is gone. It's entirely gone. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And I think that was one of the principal reasons why the October 7th attack was launched. And that is the Hamas leadership, that is the leadership in Gaza, saw the movement toward normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia being brokered by the United States, and that would just bring an end to the Palestinian cause as they viewed it, not necessarily the establishment of a Palestinian state, and they were determined to prevent that from happening. The other point that I wanted to make in reference to your question about demonstrations on American university campuses, for Glenn and me, this would be very reminiscent of the hot summer of 1968, when we had university students taking over various campus buildings, from the University of Wisconsin to Berkeley to Stanford, I think to Columbia, and a number of other universities. Cities were literally on fire. And by the way, some of this was related to the civil rights movement. Some of it was, of course, anti-Vietnam. it was, and of course, it was the year when both Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. So it was an awful year, and it led to a disaster for the Democrats because it all exploded at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where it got out of hand. Mayor Daley and the Chicago police went to the extremes in confronting the demonstrators, and some of whom broke into the convention itself, and it ended up causing great harm to the Democrats. Hubert Humphrey was the candidate for the presidency, and of course they ended up losing to Richard Nixon, and who was not a particularly popular person, but nevertheless, I think the experience of 1968 basically sent a signal to the American people: we have to restore order in the House. I don't think what we're seeing today is anywhere near that level.
Yeah,
anywhere near that level. For one thing, that sentiment that the students were expressing vis-a-vis the Vietnam War was shared by a significant portion of the American population. And while there's not unanimous support for what we're doing in terms of supporting Israel today, there is a significant majority of Americans who still strongly support Israel, although that support is beginning to erode, particularly among younger people.
exactly.
And if I were the Israelis, I would take note of this. The future, in terms of their support from the United States, does not look good. It really doesn't. The boomer generation is moving on. These are the strong supporters today of Israel, and subsequent generations, particularly Gen Z, the big one, the sort of pig in the snake, so to speak, has very different attitude toward Israel. Does not look at Israel anything like their parents or grandparents, and the Israelis need to take note of this. Otherwise, within 10 years, we could see a significant change in the direction of American support for Israel.
Well, the internal politics is affecting foreign policy. On the one hand, you have the Republicans committed very strongly to the defense of Israel, to the extent of writing a carte blanche for Bibi Netanyahu. And then, of course, you have the left of the Democratic Party, and especially the Muslim American support, which is extremely anti-US support for Israel. So for Joe Biden, who is presiding over a party which is divided, this makes for a pretty tricky situation.
Oh, there's no question about it. And Joe Biden is almost in an impossible situation. And he truly is a supporter and admirer of Israel and the Israeli people.
He's called himself a Zionist.
Yes.
He can't go no further than that.
Exactly. And the Israelis will have no better friend in the United States government than him. Chuck Schumer, who's pretty close to that point,
Isn't
well.
he Jewish as well? Isn't
He
Chuck
is
Schumer
Jewish?
Jewish?
He's the leading Jewish member of the United States Congress, whether in the House or the Senate. In this case, the majority leader in the Senate. So this is the red flag that's being waved to Israel, and in particular to Bibi Netanyahu, because Bibi Netanyahu has this visceral opposition. It's almost congenital, I think, in terms of being able to accept a Palestinian state. And the Israeli people are going to have to overcome this, at least in my view. I'm not suggesting at all that this will be easy. There are 7 options for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. 6 of them are highly objectionable by one side or the other. And the 6th and the 7th one is the one that's most difficult, a 2-state solution. But nevertheless, it's the only path out of this conflict.
This is the tragedy.
Just
there are so
if I
many
can
tragedies in
interject before
international
you,
relations.
if I can interject, it would be good for our viewers to remember that Bibi Netanyahu sunk the peace process back in the Oslo peace process back in the day in the 90s when Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat had that famous historic handshake in the White House. And the key person who destroyed any chance of peace at the time was Bibi Netanyahu on the Jewish side. And of course, there was the Intifada on the Palestinian side too. That didn't help. And so the entire period that had great hope for a two-state solution ended up in smoke. Please, over to you, Glenn.
Well, I think you're touching upon the point I wanted to make. This is one of the tragedies, and it truly is a tragedy of Israeli politics and of the Middle East. A clear majority of Israelis is willing to accept a two-state solution. Any number of Israelis, when I was there, said to me, and I'll quote one of them, "I am ashamed of my country," because the Israelis, scotched a two-state solution that was at hand, which isn't to say that they to let off the hook, as you pointed out, the Palestinians themselves, who have their own tragic reality, which is that despite the best efforts and the consciousness of the consequences of certain acts, one's intrinsic nature dooms one to act in a way that leads to one's own destruction. That's tragedy. That's the Greek tragedy, and that's what Israel has done to itself, is doing to itself, and what the Palestinians too have done to themselves. And reason is irrelevant. I think Gary and you, Atul, both touched upon Netanyahu. He's a Machiavellian politician, yes, but he also is sincere in his beliefs, and
he's messianic as well. He's messianic as well.
Israel is Judea and Samaria are for the Jews, and rather than parts of the West Bank and Gaza could be for the Palestinians. And it makes and then you have equal millennial sincerity on the other side, and it makes a solution impossible unless somehow the majority of the populations can actually, respectively in Israel and in the Palestinians, seize control of the political process. But it's hard to see, given the structure of Israeli democracy, how that can happen at this time.
It is important to point out, Atul, history is, understanding the history of this conflict is vitally important, and it's something that I think many of the young people may not understand. These are people who've been demonstrating on some university campuses. There was a time when the two parties came this close. They were extraordinarily close, and I'm referring to 2000, when President Clinton assembled the Israeli and Palestinian leaderships at Camp David for a period of very intense negotiations, and Ehud Barak tabled the most advanced set of principles for reaching peace that had ever been presented by either side, and even went further during the course of those negotiations, thanks to the encouragement of President Bill Clinton. And they came extraordinarily close. They really did, in satisfying all the key needs of the Palestinians as well as the Israelis. Of course, they did not reach an understanding, and that's certainly very unfortunate, but that wasn't the real tragedy. The real tragedy was, of course, that the Palestinians left. Clinton followed up with his Clinton parameters and sought to negotiate at a distance with both sides, and they continued to make more progress, so that literally days before he left office, they were on the verge of reaching a set of understandings that would have led to peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and the ultimate establishment of a Palestinian state. And Israel went even further in terms of what it had presented to the Palestinians. In the end, Yasser Arafat could not accept it. The tragedy of that was not that he wasn't able to accept it, because that's the nature of negotiations. You continue to negotiate until the two sides realize that they've gone as far as they possibly could. And in the case of the Palestinians under Yasser Arafat, they were not willing to negotiate further. They cut off the negotiations, although subsequent U.S. administrations tried to resuscitate them, unfortunately, unsuccessfully. But he launched the Second Intifada, which actually had begun some months previous. And so when the Israelis saw that their extended hand of peace was met with a slap across the face, it turned Israelis against any kind of peace. And that situation has only worsened since 2000. And every incident that we can point to has only illustrated that and deepened their objection to willingness to negotiate a peace. I mean, one thing Bibi gets right, there is no Palestinian partner. Well, he had a hand in that by undermining the Palestinian Authority, which had recognized the state of Israel, had disavowed violence. And
we forget, Mossad, even the Israelis went so far as to promote Hamas in the early days to undercut Fatah.
Yes, and to their misfortune, because
very short-sighted, but they did it. So I think neither side can claim to be saints here. Everyone has their hands dipped in blood here. As
Itzhak Rabin did remark once in an interview here in the U.S. So, but my point is that it is possible. I always say that the first requirement for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians is heroic leadership. Without that, it won't happen. With heroic leadership, you can get the two sides to push and push hard their respective populations to understand that the only solution to this conflict is diplomacy, reaching an agreement, as difficult as it's going to be, with very hard concessions and compromises on both sides that are going to leave bad tastes in everyone's mouth. Because here you have two people driving so hard to establish their identities in this very small patch of land. And there's no way that can be done with a lot of compromise and sacrifice on both sides. We've seen the sacrifice part. We're still waiting to see the compromise. And as I said, heroic leadership. And we have not seen that.
So the Palestinians need a Nelson Mandela and the Israelis need an FWD clerk.
That's probably a pretty good way to put it.
All right. On that note, thank you, gentlemen, for your time. It's been a pleasure and a privilege speaking with you, and I will see you both next time.
Pleasure to be with you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.